It started with a kick, a sharp, deliberate act of humiliation. The police officer stood over the man, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights of the precinct lobby. "What are you even doing here?" he sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "Men like you don't belong in places like this." The man, dressed in a tailored suit now smudged with dirt from the scuffle, didn't retaliate. He simply stared at the officer, his eyes calm but piercing, as if daring him to continue. The officer took the bait. "You think that fancy suit makes you somebody," he scoffed. "I've seen your kind before. Always acting like the rules don't apply to you." He kicked the man again, harder this time, his laughter echoing through the nearly empty room. "You'll learn. We make sure people like you know their place around here." For a moment, the man didn't move. He stayed on the cold floor, letting the insult and the kick settle. Then, slowly, he stood up. Straightening his tie, he dusted off his pants, never breaking eye contact with the officer. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, deliberate, and chillingly calm. "I'll give you one piece of advice. Be very careful who you step on while you're climbing up. You never know who you'll meet on your way down." The officer's smirk faltered, just for a second, but he quickly recovered, barking a laugh as he turned away. "Yeah, sure. Whatever you say, tough guy." He didn't even notice the man being ushered past him moments later, through a set of secure doors, into the heart of the building where only high-ranking officials were allowed. It wasn't until the murmurs started, hushed voices of officers exchanging quick, incredulous glances, that the reality began to dawn on him. One of his colleagues leaned in, whispering urgently. "Do you have any idea who that is?" The officer's face contorted into a frown. "Just another punk in a suit who thinks he's untouchable," he snapped, still oblivious to the storm brewing around him. But the whispers grew louder, and then came the announcement over the intercom, "Attention, all personnel. Please welcome the new FBI division chief." The room went silent. Every head turned toward the secure doors as they opened again, revealing the same man the officer had just humiliated. Only now, he wasn't just a man in a suit. He was the man in charge. The officer's face turned pale. He stumbled back a step, his arrogance evaporating in an instant. His heart pounded as he replayed the scene in his mind, every insult, every kick, every word laced with hatred, and the horrifying realization that this wasn't just any man. This was the one person who could dismantle his career with a single phone call. The division chief didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The silence in the room was deafening as he walked past the stunned officers, his authority radiating with every step. But just as he reached the door to his new office, he paused. Turning his head slightly, he addressed the room, his voice calm but laced with steel. "In this building, we don't tolerate abuse of power or disrespect. From anyone. Is that clear?" The officer couldn't move. He couldn't speak. He could only watch as the man he tried to demean disappeared into the office marked with his new title. His legs felt weak, his chest tight with panic. What would happen to him now? Would he lose his badge? His career? His dignity? He thought he was in control, that his authority made him untouchable. But now, he realized he was standing on a crumbling pedestal, and the ground beneath him was about to give way. What happened next would leave not just the officer, but the entire precinct, in shock. Because when justice comes knocking, it doesn't ask permission. How far would the division chief go to make his point? And what would become of the officer who thought he was untouchable? Stay tuned, because this is only the beginning. Hello, friends. Here at Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against all forms of racism and discrimination. We believe in equality, respect, and justice for everyone, regardless of their race or background. To anyone watching who has experienced prejudice or injustice, we see you, we stand with you, and we are committed to telling stories that shed light on these issues. Thank you for being here with us. If you enjoy thought-provoking and emotional stories with unexpected twists, please subscribe to our channel and join our growing community. Now, sit back, relax, and get ready for a story that will leave you speechless. Enjoy! The precinct was alive with its usual rhythm, phones ringing incessantly, officers hurrying between desks, and the steady hum of muted conversations filling the air. It was an ordinary day in a bustling police department, but beneath the surface, the place carried an undercurrent of tension, one that often went unnoticed but was deeply felt by those who didn't fit the mold. Among the chaos sat Officer Greg Williams, a man whose presence commanded attention but for all the wrong reasons. Greg had worked his way up from patrol duty to a comfortable desk job overseeing other officers. In his late 40s, his stocky build and buzz-cut hair gave him the look of someone who lived for order and discipline, but his demeanor often betrayed a simmering bitterness. He was known for his sharp tongue and a brand of authority that veered uncomfortably close to abuse. His colleagues joked that he had a sixth sense for spotting trouble, but for many, it was no joke. Greg's disdain for certain groups of people was no secret. He never said anything outright, he was too careful for that, but his actions spoke volumes. The way his demeanor shifted when dealing with black men in particular, the way he always seemed to escalate situations unnecessarily, the way his tone became condescending, it was all there. Some officers avoided him, others admired him, but few challenged him. Greg liked it that way. On this particular day, Greg sat back in his chair, flipping through a file with little interest. He was waiting for his next task, but his mind was already on the weekend, where he'd be grilling burgers in his backyard, pretending the world outside didn't exist. His life was comfortable enough, an easy job, a decent house in the suburbs, a wife who tolerated his gruff demeanor, and 2 kids who were used to his absence. He saw himself as a man who had earned his position, someone who didn't owe anyone anything. Across town, Marcus Evans stepped out of his car and adjusted his tie. The black sedan gleamed in the sunlight, a reflection of its owner's meticulous nature. Marcus was a man who thrived on precision and order, but unlike Greg, his authority was rooted in respect rather than fear. At 42, Marcus had risen through the ranks of federal law enforcement, a career that demanded both intellect and resilience. Born and raised in Chicago's South Side, he knew what it meant to face adversity. His parents had worked tirelessly to provide for him and his siblings, and their sacrifices had instilled in him a sense of responsibility to uplift others. Marcus wasn't just good at his job, he was exceptional. He had a reputation for taking on tough cases and for handling his subordinates with fairness and integrity. His new role as FBI Division Chief was a culmination of years of hard work and a testament to his unwavering commitment to justice. But Marcus also knew that the path he'd taken wasn't without its challenges. He had faced discrimination in various forms, from subtle microaggressions to blatant acts of racism, and each experience had left its mark. He had learned to navigate these obstacles with grace, but the scars they left were a reminder of the work that still needed to be done. As Marcus entered the precinct for the first time, he felt a mix of anticipation and resolve. This was his chance to make a difference, to address systemic issues from within, and to hold people accountable. He walked through the doors with the quiet confidence of someone who knew his worth, but as he looked around, he couldn't help but notice the way some officers stared. A few nodded respectfully, others avoided eye contact, and then there were those, like Greg, whose glances carried a hint of disdain. Greg noticed Marcus immediately. The suit, the confident stride, the air of authority, it all rubbed him the wrong way. To Greg, Marcus represented everything he disliked, someone who didn't belong in his world yet had somehow managed to infiltrate it. Greg didn't know who Marcus was, but he didn't care. To him, Marcus was just another guy trying to play a role he didn't deserve. The precinct's front desk was chaotic as usual, with people coming and going, papers being shuffled, and phones ringing off the hook. Marcus stood patiently, waiting for assistance, but Greg saw an opportunity. He approached with his usual swagger, his eyes narrowing as he sized Marcus up. "You lost?" Greg asked, his tone sharp and condescending. This isn't the DMV. Marcus turned to face him, his expression calm but unreadable. I'm exactly where I need to be, he said evenly. But Greg wasn't satisfied. He took a step closer, invading Marcus's space. You sure about that? Because we don't usually see people like you walking in here like you own the place. The tension in the room was palpable. Other officers glanced over but didn't intervene. Some looked uncomfortable, others seemed to enjoy the show. Marcus held Greg's gaze, unflinching. Is there a problem, officer? He asked, his voice steady. Greg smirked. No problem at all, he said, but the sarcasm in his tone was undeniable. Before Marcus could respond, a senior officer approached, his face pale with recognition. Sir, he said, addressing Marcus with a sudden shift in tone. We've been expecting you. Please, right this way. Greg froze, his smirk vanishing as he looked between Marcus and the senior officer. The realization hit him like a freight train, but it was too late. Marcus didn't even glance back as he followed the senior officer into the secure area of the precinct, leaving Greg standing there, humiliated and seething. In his office, Marcus allowed himself a moment to breathe. He had faced men like Greg before, and he knew this wouldn't be the last time. But this was different. Here, he had the power to do more than just endure. He had the power to change things. Greg, meanwhile, sat at his desk, replaying the encounter in his mind. His confidence was shaken, but his anger simmered just below the surface. He didn't know what would come next, but he had a sinking feeling that his actions were about to catch up with him. The precinct buzzed with activity the following day, but the tension that hung in the air was impossible to ignore. Officer Greg Williams sat at his desk, his mind racing. The encounter from the day before replayed endlessly in his head, each detail sharpening his sense of unease. He'd been so certain of his place in the world, so comfortable in his authority, but now everything felt off balance. He hadn't been officially reprimanded or called out for his behavior, but the silence was almost worse. Whispers followed him everywhere. Conversation stopped abruptly when he walked into a room. The usual camaraderie among his colleagues had vanished, replaced with awkward glances and tight-lipped nods. Greg tapped his pen against the desk, trying to focus on the report in front of him, but the words blurred together. He couldn't stop thinking about the man in the suit, the one he'd mocked and humiliated. He hadn't even bothered to learn his name. It wasn't like him to feel regret, but there was something about the way the man had carried himself, the quiet authority in his voice, that gnawed at him. His thoughts were interrupted when Sergeant Daniels, a gruff but fair man in his early 50s, approached his desk. Daniels was one of the few people Greg respected, mostly because he didn't tolerate nonsense. Daniels leaned against the desk, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Williams, he said, his tone calm but firm, we need to talk. Greg's stomach tightened. Sure, Sarge. What's up? Daniels didn't respond right away. He studied Greg for a moment, his gaze steady and unflinching. Do you have any idea who you were talking to yesterday? He asked finally. Greg tried to play it off with a shrug, but the edge in Daniels' voice made it clear this wasn't a casual question. Some guy in a suit, Greg said, keeping his tone light. Looked like he thought he owned the place. Daniels' jaw tightened. That guy in a suit is your new boss. Marcus Evans. He's the division chief for the FBI, and he's here to oversee operations at this precinct. So, when you kicked him and ran your mouth, you weren't just being disrespectful. You were digging your own grave. The words hit Greg like a punch to the gut. He opened his mouth to respond, but no sound came out. Daniels leaned in closer, lowering his voice. I've covered for you more times than I can count, Williams. But this? This is on you. And if you think Evans is just going to let it slide, you're more naive than I thought. Greg tried to muster a defense, but all he could manage was a weak, it was a misunderstanding. Daniels straightened, his expression hardening. You'd better hope he sees it that way. Because if he doesn't, you're done here. With that, Daniels walked away, leaving Greg sitting there, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the edge of the desk. As the day wore on, Greg found himself watching Evans from a distance. The division chief moved through the precinct with quiet confidence, his presence commanding respect without needing to demand it. He spoke to officers and staff with a level of professionalism that was almost unsettling to Greg. It was clear that Evans wasn't just another bureaucrat. He was someone who had earned his position, someone who wasn't afraid to hold people accountable. By mid-afternoon, Greg's anxiety had turned to anger. He didn't like the way Evans made him feel, like he was the one being judged, like he was the one who didn't belong. He was tired of the whispers, the sideways glances, the suffocating tension. He decided he needed to confront Evans directly, to clear the air and put the whole thing behind him. Greg found Evans in one of the precinct's conference rooms, reviewing files with a small team of FBI agents. He hesitated at the door, his confidence wavering, but then he pushed it open and stepped inside. The room went quiet as everyone turned to look at him. Evans raised an eyebrow, his expression calm but curious. "Can I have a word?" Greg asked, his voice steady despite the knot in his stomach. Evans nodded, gesturing for the team to continue without him. He followed Greg into the hallway, his hands in his pockets, his demeanor as composed as ever. "What can I do for you, Officer Williams?" he asked. Greg cleared his throat, trying to find the right words. "Look, about yesterday. I didn't know who you were. If I had, I wouldn't have." He stopped himself, realizing how weak the excuse sounded. Evans tilted his head slightly, his gaze sharp but not unkind. "You wouldn't have what? Kicked me? Insulted me? Treated me like less than human?" Greg felt his face flush. "It was a mistake," he said quickly. "I let my temper get the best of me. It won't happen again." Evans studied him for a moment, and Greg couldn't tell what he was thinking. Finally, Evans spoke. "I appreciate the apology, Officer Williams. But let me make one thing clear. This isn't about me. This is about the culture in this precinct. It's about accountability. And as long as I'm here, that's going to change." Greg's jaw tightened, but he nodded, knowing he had no choice but to play along. "Understood, sir," he said, forcing the words out. Evans nodded once, then turned and walked away, leaving Greg standing there, feeling more exposed than ever. The encounter had only deepened his unease. He couldn't shake the feeling that Evans wasn't done with him yet. Over the next few days, Greg's paranoia grew. Every conversation he overheard, every glance in his direction, felt like a judgment. He began to notice small changes in the precinct, new protocols, more oversight, and increased emphasis on accountability. It was subtle, but it was clear that Evans was making his presence felt. Greg tried to convince himself that he was imagining things, that Evans had bigger concerns than one rogue officer. But deep down, he knew better. Evans wasn't the type to let things slide. And Greg had given him plenty of reason to act. The tension reached a boiling point when Greg was called into a meeting with Evans and several senior officers. As he walked into the room, his heart pounded in his chest. He didn't know what to expect, but he had a sinking feeling that whatever was coming next would change everything. The conference room was silent, the air thick with tension as Greg Williams sat at the far end of the table. His palms were slick with sweat, and his jaw was clenched so tightly it ached. Across from him sat Marcus Evans, his calm demeanor contrasting sharply with Greg's unease. Surrounding them were senior officers and FBI agents, their faces unreadable but their presence undeniable. This wasn't a routine meeting, it was something far more serious. Evans folded his hands on the table, his expression unreadable. His voice, when he finally spoke, was measured but carried a weight that silenced any lingering whispers in the room. "Officer Williams, I called this meeting to address several ongoing issues within this precinct. As you are aware, the culture here has raised concerns at the federal level, and part of my role is to identify the root causes of these problems. Greg forced himself to meet Evan's gaze, his stomach churning. He had spent the past few days convincing himself that Evans would move on, that this was just a routine reshuffling of authority. But now, sitting here under the weight of Evans' words, he realized just how wrong he had been. Evans continued, his tone unwavering. Over the last week, I've reviewed countless reports, listened to officers, and studied patterns in behavior and incidents. What I've found is troubling, to say the least. And, Officer Williams, your name appears more frequently than most. Greg's throat tightened, but he refused to let it show. He straightened in his chair, forcing himself to speak. With all due respect, sir, I've served this department for over 20 years. My record speaks for itself. If there are issues, I'd like to know exactly what I'm being accused of. Evans leaned back slightly, his calm composure unshaken. I appreciate your confidence in your record, Officer Williams. So let's address it directly. Excessive force complaints, inappropriate conduct during stops, a pattern of targeting specific demographics, all documented, all unresolved. These aren't accusations. These are facts. The room seemed to hold its breath. Greg's face flushed, his composure beginning to crack. Those complaints were baseless, he said, his voice rising. Made by people who don't understand the pressures of this job. I've always acted in the best interest of this department and the community. Evans didn't flinch. His voice remained steady, but his words cut deep. The best interest of the community? Tell me, Officer Williams, how does kicking a man who posed no threat serve the community? The room fell silent again, the weight of the question hanging heavily in the air. Greg shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his mind racing for a response. That was a misunderstanding, he muttered, his voice barely audible. I didn't know who you were. Evans leaned forward, his gaze locking onto Greg's. And if you had? Would your actions have been any different? Or is the respect you show someone dependent on their rank, their status, their ability to hold you accountable? Greg's face burned, and he opened his mouth to respond, but Evans didn't give him the chance. This isn't about me. It's about a pattern of behavior that reflects poorly not just on you, but on this entire precinct. And that stops now. One of the senior officers cleared his throat, breaking the tension momentarily. Chief Evans, he began, his tone cautious, are you suggesting disciplinary action against Officer Williams? Evans didn't hesitate. I'm suggesting accountability. Officer Williams' behavior has been allowed to continue unchecked for far too long. It's not just about punishment, it's about setting a precedent. We can't demand respect from the community if we don't hold ourselves to the same standard. Greg felt the walls closing in. His mind raced as he tried to find a way out, a way to regain control. I've given my life to this department, he said, his voice shaking with barely contained anger. I've sacrificed for this job, for the people here. And now you're going to ruin my career over one mistake. Evans' expression softened slightly, but his resolve remained. This isn't about ruining your career, Officer Williams. It's about addressing the harm that's been done and ensuring it doesn't happen again. You talk about sacrifice, but what about the people who've suffered because of your actions? What about their sacrifices? Greg's fists clenched under the table. He wanted to fight back, to defend himself, but he could feel the tide turning against him. The other officers in the room avoided his gaze, their silence speaking volumes. For the first time in his career, Greg felt powerless. Evans turned to the senior officers, his tone decisive. Effective immediately, Officer Williams is placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. During that time, I expect full cooperation from everyone in this precinct as we work to rebuild trust with the community. Greg shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. You can't do this, he said, his voice rising. You're making a mistake. Evans stood as well, his calm demeanor never wavering. The only mistake would be ignoring this. You've had years to change, Officer Williams. Now it's time to face the consequences of your choices. Greg stared at Evans, his chest heaving with anger and frustration. For a moment, it seemed like he might lash out, but then he turned and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed through the precinct, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. Evans took a deep breath, his gaze sweeping over the remaining officers. "This is just the beginning," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "We have a lot of work to do, and it's not going to be easy. But if we're serious about change, it starts here. It starts now." The officers nodded, some more reluctantly than others, but no one spoke. As the meeting adjourned, Evans returned to his office, the weight of the day settling heavily on his shoulders. He knew this wasn't the end of the fight, it was only the beginning. And the hardest battles were still to come. Greg's boots hit the floor heavily as he stormed down the corridor, his steps echoing with anger and frustration. Each step felt like an attempt to shake off the weight that had settled on his chest. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, none of them comforting. His confidence, his authority, everything he had built for himself, felt like it was slipping through his fingers. The locker room door came into view, and with a hard push, he shoved it open, letting it slam shut behind him with a force that reverberated through the empty room. The space was quiet, devoid of the usual chatter of officers preparing for their shifts, as if even the walls could sense the tension radiating from him. He threw his gear onto the bench, the sound of metal clanging against wood echoing sharply. Sitting down heavily, he buried his face in his hands, his elbows resting on his knees. Greg's mind churned with a chaotic mix of emotions, anger at Marcus Evans, who had come into the precinct and upended everything, frustration at his colleagues, who now seemed to look at him with judgment or pity, and, beneath it all, a growing sense of unease that he couldn't shake. For the first time in his career, Greg felt truly powerless. The door creaked open behind him, the sound pulling him from his thoughts. He didn't bother to look up, assuming it was one of his fellow officers, maybe Daniels, come to lecture him again. But the footsteps were measured, deliberate, and when the voice came, it was one he instantly recognized, one that made his stomach tighten with a mix of anger and dread. "Officer Williams," Marcus Evans said, his voice calm but firm, the kind of tone that demanded attention without ever needing to raise in volume. "I figured you'd be here." Greg didn't look up immediately. He stayed hunched over, his hands still pressed against his face as he muttered, "What do you want now? Haven't you done enough?" Evans stepped further into the room, his polished shoes clicking softly against the tile floor. He stopped a few feet away, maintaining enough distance to give Greg space but close enough to ensure he couldn't be ignored. "I didn't come here to cause more trouble, Greg," Evans said, his tone even. "I came to talk. To give you a chance to understand what's happening and why it's happening." Greg finally lifted his head, his eyes bloodshot from a restless night and his expression a mixture of exhaustion and resentment. "Understand what? That you're here to ruin me? That you couldn't wait to walk in here and tear everything apart?" Evans stayed where he was, his expression steady and unreadable. His voice didn't waver as he replied, "This was never about ruining you. It's about accountability. Something that's been missing in this precinct for a long time." Greg let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head as he stood abruptly, the bench scraping loudly against the floor. "Accountability? Is that what you call this? You don't know what it's like to work in this place, the pressure we're under every day. You don't know the choices we have to make out there. But sure, go ahead and sit there in your suit and talk about accountability." Evans' gaze didn't falter. He took a small step closer, his hands resting loosely in his pockets, his demeanor calm but commanding. "You're right, Greg. I don't know every choice you've made. But I know what it feels like to be on the receiving end of those choices. I know what it's like to be seen as less than human, to be judged and dismissed because of someone else's assumptions. And I know that the badge you wear isn't just a symbol of authority, it's a symbol of trust. A trust that you've broken. Greg's fists clenched at his sides, his jaw tightening as he tried to suppress the mix of emotions bubbling to the surface. You think you're better than me, don't you? He snapped, his voice rising. You walk in here with your fancy title and your speeches about justice, and you think you have the right to tell me how to do my job. You don't know me, Evans. You don't know what it's taken for me to get here. Evans didn't back down. His voice remained steady, his words deliberate. You're right, Greg. I don't know your full story. But I do know that your pain, your struggles, they don't give you the right to inflict pain on others. They don't justify the choices you've made that have caused harm. And if you think I'm here to let that slide, you're mistaken. Greg turned away, his frustration boiling over as he began pacing the length of the locker room. His movements were quick, agitated, like a caged animal searching for an escape. You think I'm the only one who does this? He shot back, his voice filled with defiance. You think this precinct isn't full of guys just like me, doing what needs to be done to survive? I'm not the problem. The system is. Evans nodded slightly, his expression thoughtful, as if considering Greg's words carefully. You're not wrong, he said finally. The system is broken. But that doesn't absolve you of your responsibility. You're part of that system, Greg. And you have a choice to make. You can keep contributing to the problem, or you can be part of the solution. But you can't have it both ways. Greg stopped pacing, his back turned to Evans. His shoulders were hunched, his head bowed, as if the weight of Evans' words was pressing down on him. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. The silence stretched between them, heavy and tense. Finally, he turned around, his face a mixture of anger, confusion, and something else, something closer to vulnerability. What do you want from me? He asked, his voice quieter now, almost pleading. Evans took another step closer, his tone softening but losing none of its firmness. I want you to take responsibility. Not just for what you did to me, but for all the choices you've made that have hurt others. I want you to see that the badge you wear doesn't give you a free pass, it gives you a responsibility. And I want you to decide if you're ready to change or if you're going to let this be the end of your story. Greg felt his throat tighten, the weight of Evans' words hitting him harder than he'd expected. He sank back onto the bench, his head in his hands, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know if I can, he admitted, his tone raw and filled with uncertainty. I don't know if I even know how. Evans sat down across from him, his posture relaxed but his eyes unwavering. Change isn't easy, he said, his voice calm but resolute. It's messy and uncomfortable, and it takes time. But it starts with one choice. One moment of accountability. And from there, it grows. The question is, Greg, are you willing to take that first step? Greg looked up slowly, his eyes searching Evans' face for any sign of insincerity. But all he saw was honesty, a man willing to offer him a lifeline instead of letting him drown. For the first time in a long time, Greg felt something shift inside him, a glimmer of something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. The silence between them lingered, but it felt different now. It wasn't the heavy silence of tension or judgment. It was the quiet of something new, something uncertain but not unwelcome. Greg didn't know what came next, but for the first time, he was willing to consider the possibility of something better. And for Marcus Evans, that was enough to begin. The locker room felt colder after Marcus Evans left. Greg Williams sat in silence, the walls closing in on him as the reality of the situation began to sink in. The words Evans had spoken lingered in his mind, replaying like a broken record. Responsibility. Accountability. Change. They weren't foreign concepts, but hearing them directed at him, with such clarity and conviction, felt like being hit by a wave he hadn't seen coming. He stared at the ground, his hands gripping the edge of the bench so tightly his knuckles turned white. The anger he had clung to for so long was beginning to dissipate, leaving behind something far more unsettling, doubt. Greg had built his career on certainty. He was certain he knew right from wrong. He was certain his actions, no matter how questionable, were justified. He was certain he was the kind of officer this precinct needed. But now, those certainties felt hollow. If Marcus Evans was right, and Greg was starting to think he might be, then everything he believed about himself was a lie. That thought terrified him more than losing his badge ever could. Outside the locker room, the precinct carried on as usual, but there was an undercurrent of tension that everyone could feel. Officers exchanged glances, their conversations hushed. Greg's confrontation with Evans had spread like wildfire, and while no one said it outright, the air was thick with speculation. Some were quietly relieved, others outraged, but no one could deny that change was coming. The unspoken question on everyone's mind was simple: what would happen next? Greg finally stood, his legs unsteady beneath him. He couldn't stay in the locker room forever, but the thought of facing his colleagues felt like walking into a firing squad. He took a deep breath, steeling himself, and pushed open the door. The noise of the precinct hit him immediately, phones ringing, voices overlapping, the occasional shuffle of paperwork. But as he walked to his desk, he noticed the way people looked at him. Some stared openly, their expressions a mix of curiosity and judgment. Others avoided his gaze entirely, as if proximity to him might make them complicit in whatever fallout was coming. He sat down heavily, his desk feeling less like a place of authority and more like a cage. The paperwork in front of him blurred as his mind wandered. He thought about the choices he'd made over the years, the stops that escalated unnecessarily, the complaints he'd dismissed as the whining of people who didn't understand the job, the subtle but undeniable bias that had shaped so many of his actions. For the first time, he began to question those choices, not from a place of defensiveness but from a place of genuine self-reflection. It was uncomfortable, like trying to read a book in a language he barely understood. The day dragged on, each minute feeling longer than the last. At one point, Sergeant Daniels stopped by, leaning against Greg's desk with his usual no-nonsense demeanor. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low enough that no one else could hear. It wasn't an accusation, nor was it an offer of comfort. It was a simple question, but Greg struggled to answer it. "I don't know," Greg admitted after a long pause. His voice was quieter than he intended, and for a moment, he felt exposed. Daniels nodded, his expression unreadable, and after a moment, he walked away without another word. As the day wore on, Greg found himself watching Evans from a distance. The division chief moved through the precinct with the same quiet authority he had displayed since his arrival. He spoke to officers, listened to their concerns, and made decisions with a level of thoughtfulness that Greg had to begrudgingly respect. It was clear that Evans wasn't just here to enforce rules, he was here to lead. And that realization made Greg's resentment harder to hold on to. By the time his shift ended, Greg was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. He drove home in silence, the radio turned off for the first time in years. The streets were dark, illuminated only by the occasional streetlight. His usual route felt unfamiliar, like he was driving through a city he didn't recognize. When he finally pulled into his driveway, he sat in the car for a long time, staring at the house in front of him. The thought of facing his family, of pretending everything was fine, felt impossible. He eventually forced himself inside, the sound of the door closing behind him breaking the silence. His wife, Karen, looked up from the couch, her expression wary. She had seen the tension in him before, but tonight it was different. He looked smaller. Less sure of himself. "How was work?" she asked, her voice careful. Greg hesitated, the weight of the day pressing down on him. "It was a lot," he said finally, collapsing into a chair. Karen watched him, her concern evident, but she didn't press. She knew better than to push him when he was like this. Later that night, as Greg lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he couldn't stop thinking about what Evans had said. The idea of accountability, of taking responsibility for his actions, felt like staring into the abyss. But the alternative, continuing as he had, ignoring the damage he'd caused, felt even worse. The question Evans had posed echoed in his mind, relentless in its simplicity: are you willing to change? The next morning, Greg arrived at the precinct earlier than usual. The air was cool and crisp, the kind of morning that used to invigorate him. But today, it felt different. He walked into the building with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years, though he wasn't entirely sure what that purpose was. He found Evans in his office, reviewing a stack of files. The division chief looked up as Greg knocked on the doorframe, his expression neutral but curious. "Officer Williams," he said, setting the files aside. "What can I do for you?" Greg stepped inside, closing the door behind him. He hesitated for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest, before finally speaking. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began, his voice steady but quiet. "About accountability. About change. I don't know if I can fix everything I've done, but I want to try." Evans studied him for a moment, his expression softening slightly. "That's a start," he said simply. "But it's going to take more than words, Greg. It's going to take action." Greg nodded, his resolve hardening. "I'm ready to do the work," he said. "Whatever it takes." Evans leaned back in his chair, a small, almost imperceptible smile playing at the corners of his lips. "Then let's get to work." Greg sat across from Marcus Evans in the quiet of the division chief's office, the early morning light streaming through the blinds casting sharp shadows across the room. The silence between them was heavy, not awkward but purposeful, as if both men were choosing their next words carefully. Greg had never been in this position before, vulnerable, uncertain, and painfully aware that the man sitting across from him held not just his career but his sense of identity in his hands. Evans broke the silence first, his voice calm but firm, each word measured and deliberate. "I appreciate that you're here, Greg. It takes courage to admit you've made mistakes and to take the first step toward fixing them. But I need you to understand something. This isn't going to be easy, and it's not going to be quick. Change, real change, requires more than words. It requires action and a willingness to confront the parts of yourself that you might not want to face." Greg nodded slowly, his hands resting on his knees. He wanted to say something, to show that he understood, but the weight of what Evans was saying kept him silent. For years, he had operated on autopilot, never questioning his actions, his motives, or the consequences of the choices he made. Now, for the first time, he was being forced to confront the possibility that he wasn't the man he thought he was. Evans leaned forward slightly, his hands folded on the desk. "Let's start with yesterday. You came to me in the locker room and said you didn't know how to change, that you didn't know if you could. I want you to tell me why. What's holding you back?" Greg hesitated, the question hitting him harder than he expected. He looked down at his hands, calloused and worn from years of work, and took a deep breath. I guess it's because I don't know where to start," he admitted, his voice quieter than usual. "When you've spent so long doing things a certain way, it feels like it's too late to turn around. Like no matter what you do, people are always going to see you the same way." Evans nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That's understandable," he said. "But here's the thing, Greg, the way people see you isn't set in stone. It's shaped by your actions, by the choices you make moving forward. And while you can't change the past, you have control over what you do from this moment on. The question is, are you willing to do what it takes to earn back that trust?" Greg looked up, meeting Evans' gaze for the first time since entering the room. There was no judgment in Evans' eyes, only a steady resolve that felt both comforting and intimidating. "I want to," Greg said finally, his voice stronger now. "I don't know if I can fix everything I've done, but I want to try." Evans sat back in his chair, his expression softening slightly. "That's a start," he said. "But it's not enough to want it, Greg. You have to put in the work. And that means being honest, not just with me, but with yourself. About your actions, your motivations, and the impact you've had on others." Greg nodded again, his jaw tightening as he processed Evan's words. He wasn't used to this kind of introspection, and it made him uncomfortable. But he also knew that Evans was right. If he was going to change, he had to start by facing the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The conversation shifted to specifics, with Evans outlining a plan for accountability and growth. Greg would attend mandatory training sessions on bias and de-escalation tactics, participate in community outreach programs, and meet regularly with a mentor to discuss his progress. It was a lot to take in, but Greg listened intently, his determination growing with each passing moment. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose, a path forward, however difficult it might be. As the meeting came to an end, Evans stood and extended a hand. Greg hesitated for a moment before shaking it, the gesture feeling heavier than it should have. It wasn't just a handshake, it was a commitment, a promise to himself and to the people he had wronged. Over the next few weeks, Greg threw himself into the process with a mix of reluctance and determination. The training sessions were eye-opening, forcing him to confront the biases he had spent years denying. The community outreach programs were even harder, putting him face-to-face with the people who had every reason to mistrust him. There were moments when he wanted to give up, when the weight of his past felt too heavy to bear. But each time, he thought of Evans and the look in his eyes when he had said, "Change starts with one choice." It wasn't just about proving something to Evans, it was about proving something to himself. One evening, after a particularly challenging day, Greg found himself at a local community center, attending a forum on police reform. The room was packed with people from all walks of life, their voices rising and falling as they shared their stories, their frustrations, and their hopes for change. Greg sat quietly, listening, his presence more as an observer than a participant. But as the forum went on, he felt a growing need to speak, to say something, anything, that might bridge the divide between the community and the badge he wore. When the opportunity came, Greg stood, his heart pounding in his chest. The room went quiet, all eyes turning to him. He hesitated, the weight of their expectations almost too much to bear. But then he took a deep breath and began to speak. "I've made mistakes," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "More than I can count. I've hurt people, ignored their voices, and used my badge in ways I shouldn't have. And for that, I'm sorry. I can't change what I've done, but I can promise to do better. To listen, to learn, and to be the kind of officer you deserve." The silence that followed was deafening, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Greg braced himself for backlash, for anger, for rejection. But instead, a man in the back of the room stood and began to clap, slow and deliberate. Others joined in, and soon the room was filled with applause, not thunderous, not overwhelming, but steady and sincere. As Greg sat back down, his chest felt lighter than it had in years. He still had a long way to go, and he knew that earning back the trust he had broken wouldn't happen overnight. But for the first time, he felt like he was on the right path. And for Marcus Evans, watching from the back of the room, that was more than enough. The days that followed the forum were a blur of reflection and discomfort for Greg. The applause that night had been unexpected, a moment of relief in what felt like an endless uphill climb, but it hadn't erased the weight of his past. It was a small step forward, but every step after felt heavier. He had started to see the world differently, noticing things he had ignored or dismissed before, subtle looks of distrust from community members, the way certain officers behaved during stops, the tension that simmered in places he once considered routine. At the precinct, Greg felt like an outsider among people who had once been his peers. Some of his colleagues treated him with outright disdain, their judgment clear in their stares and whispered conversations. Others seemed uncertain, torn between their loyalty to him as a fellow officer and the changes he was now trying to embody. It was a strange and lonely place to be, caught between who he had been and who he was trying to become. One afternoon, as Greg sat at his desk reviewing case files, Marcus Evans appeared in the doorway of the bullpen. His presence still commanded attention, and the room quieted slightly as he stepped inside. He made his way to Greg's desk, his expression calm but focused. Greg looked up, feeling the familiar knot of anxiety tighten in his chest. "Officer Williams," Evans said, his tone neutral but carrying an undercurrent of purpose. "Do you have a moment?" Greg nodded, setting down his pen and standing. "Of course, sir." Evans gestured for him to follow, leading him into a small conference room down the hall. The room was plain, with a long table and a few chairs, but the quiet offered a reprieve from the noise of the precinct. Evans closed the door behind them, turning to face Greg. "I wanted to talk to you about the progress you've been making," Evans began, his voice even. "I've been keeping an eye on your efforts, both in the precinct and in the community. And I have to say, I see the changes you're trying to make." Greg felt a flicker of relief at the words, but he knew better than to let it show. "Thank you," he said simply, his tone subdued. Evans nodded, his expression softening slightly. "That being said, I want to be clear about something. This isn't just about making amends for the past. It's about setting an example for the future. The work you're doing isn't just for you, it's for the people you've impacted, the officers who are watching, and the community that's counting on us to do better." Greg swallowed hard, the weight of Evans' words settling over him. "I understand," he said, his voice quiet but resolute. "I'm not doing this for appearances. I know I can't undo what I've done, but I'm trying to make sure it doesn't happen again." Evans studied him for a moment, his gaze searching. "That's good to hear," he said finally. "But I need you to be prepared for what's ahead. This isn't going to get easier. There will be setbacks, challenges, and people who will question your sincerity. You need to be ready for that." Greg nodded slowly, the knot in his chest tightening. "I've already seen it," he admitted. "The looks, the whispers. It feels like I'm walking a tightrope, and one wrong move will send me over the edge." Evans' expression softened further, and for a moment, Greg saw something in his eyes that he hadn't expected: empathy. "I won't lie to you," Evans said. "That feeling might not go away anytime soon. But the fact that you're still here, still trying, says something about who you are now. And that's what matters." The words hung in the air, a lifeline Greg hadn't realized he needed. He took a deep breath, nodding again. "Thank you," he said, his voice steadier this time. "I won't let you down." Evans offered a small nod of acknowledgement before turning to leave. But just as he reached the door, he paused, glancing back over his shoulder. "Remember, Greg," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "This isn't about proving something to me. It's about proving it to yourself, and to the people who deserve better." The door closed behind him, leaving Greg alone with his thoughts. He sat back down at the table, his mind racing. The conversation had left him feeling both encouraged and overwhelmed, a mix of emotions that he was still learning to navigate. He thought about the people he had wronged, the trust he had shattered, and the uphill climb that lay ahead. For the first time in years, he felt the faintest glimmer of hope, not just for himself, but for the possibility of making things right. In the weeks that followed, Greg's efforts intensified. He threw himself into the training sessions, absorbing every lesson with a newfound sense of urgency. The community outreach programs became a cornerstone of his routine, and while the work was often difficult and emotionally taxing, it also gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. He started to build connections with people he had once dismissed, listening to their stories and learning from their experiences. One day, during a community meeting, an older woman approached him. She was small and unassuming, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Greg recognized her immediately. She was the grandmother of a young man he had arrested years ago, a case that had sparked outrage in the community. The memory of that night still haunted him, a stark reminder of the harm he had caused. "I didn't think I'd ever see the day you'd be here," the woman said, her voice trembling slightly. "But you're here. And that means something." Greg felt a lump form in his throat, and for a moment, he couldn't find the words to respond. Finally, he managed, "I'm trying." I know it doesn't erase what I did, but I'm trying to be better. The woman nodded, her gaze steady. We'll see, she said simply, her words carrying both hope and caution. Actions speak louder than words. The exchange stayed with Greg long after the meeting ended. It was a reminder that his journey wasn't about seeking forgiveness or redemption, it was about earning it, one step at a time. And while the road ahead was long and uncertain, he was finally ready to walk it. For the first time, he felt like he was moving in the right direction, and that was enough to keep him going. Months passed, and the precinct became unrecognizable from the place it once was. The culture of complacency that had taken root over the years had begun to shift under Marcus Evans' leadership. His commitment to accountability and transparency inspired some, alienated others, but above all, it forced everyone to take a hard look at themselves. Greg Williams, once the embodiment of everything Evans sought to change, was no exception. Greg had become a paradox within the precinct, a man trying to reconcile his past while navigating the uncertainty of his future. His days were filled with equal parts progress and setbacks, moments of clarity followed by reminders of the harm he had caused. The community still regarded him with skepticism, but there were glimmers of trust beginning to surface. It wasn't much, but it was a start. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow across the precinct, Marcus Evans sat in his office, reviewing reports. The door opened with a soft knock, and Greg stepped inside. He looked different, calmer, more at ease with himself, though the weight of his journey still clung to him. Evans gestured for him to sit, setting his pen aside as he gave Greg his full attention. I wanted to thank you, Greg began, his voice steady but carrying the weight of genuine emotion. For giving me the chance to turn things around. For not giving up on me when you had every reason to. Evans leaned back slightly, his expression thoughtful. I didn't give you that chance, Greg. You earned it. The choices you've made these past months weren't for me, they were for you and the people you've affected. And from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've made the most of it. Greg nodded, his throat tightening as he fought back the emotions threatening to surface. It hasn't been easy, he admitted. There were times I wanted to walk away, times I thought it wasn't worth it. But every time I felt like giving up, I remembered what you said, that it starts with one choice, and it grows from there. I didn't understand what that meant at first, but I think I do now. Evans smiled faintly, his eyes reflecting a rare warmth. Change is never easy, he said. It's uncomfortable, it's messy, and it forces us to confront parts of ourselves we'd rather ignore. But the fact that you're still here, still trying, shows me that you've got what it takes to keep moving forward. Greg exhaled deeply, a sense of relief washing over him. I want to keep doing this, he said. Not just for me, but for the precinct, for the community. I want to make things right, or at least as right as they can be. Evans stood, extending a hand. Greg took it, the handshake carrying a weight of mutual respect that hadn't been there before. For the first time, Greg felt like he wasn't just working for the precinct, he was working for something bigger, something that mattered. In the following weeks, Greg's transformation became a symbol of hope for the precinct. Officers who had once dismissed the idea of change began to reconsider their own actions, inspired by his example. The community, while still cautious, started to see the precinct as a place where their voices could be heard. Marcus Evans, true to his word, continued to push for systemic reforms, ensuring that the progress being made wasn't just surface level but deeply rooted. One particularly poignant moment came during a community event, where Greg was approached by a young man whose family had been directly affected by one of his past actions. The man's anger was palpable, his words sharp and unfiltered, but Greg listened without interruption, his heart heavy with regret. When the man finished, Greg met his gaze and said, "You're right to feel the way you do. I can't change what I did, but I promise you I'm doing everything I can to make sure it doesn't happen again." The man didn't respond immediately, but after a long pause, he nodded. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was something. And for Greg, it was enough to keep going. As the precinct continued to evolve, Marcus Evans prepared to move on to his next assignment. His time there had been transformative, not just for the department but for himself. On his last day, he called a meeting, addressing the officers with the same calm authority that had defined his leadership. "Change isn't a destination," he said. "It's a journey. And while my time here has come to an end, the work you're doing is far from over. It's up to you to carry it forward, to hold each other accountable, and to remember that every choice you make, no matter how small, has the power to make a difference. You've already started building something here, don't stop now." The room erupted in applause as Evans stepped down, his impact on the precinct undeniable. For Greg, the moment was bittersweet. He owed much of his growth to Evans, but he knew the real test would be continuing the work without him. As Evans walked through the precinct one last time, he stopped by Greg's desk. The two men exchanged a quiet nod, no words necessary. In that moment, Greg felt a sense of gratitude that went beyond anything he could express. Marcus Evans had given him the tools to rebuild his life, but it was Greg who had chosen to use them. Months later, Greg found himself standing at another community event, this time as a speaker. He shared his story openly, acknowledging his mistakes and the lessons he had learned. The crowd listened intently, their expressions a mix of skepticism and hope. When he finished, there was a moment of silence before the room erupted in applause. It wasn't the applause of celebration, it was the applause of recognition, of seeing someone take ownership of their actions and commit to being better. Greg smiled faintly, the sound filling him with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. He still had a long way to go, but for the first time, he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. Now, let's take a moment to reflect. Greg's story is one of accountability, growth, and the power of choice. It reminds us that while we can't change the past, we can choose how we move forward. It's a lesson not just for those in positions of power but for all of us, in every aspect of our lives. What would you do if faced with the chance to change? Would you take it, even if it meant confronting uncomfortable truths about yourself? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. What part of Greg's journey resonated with you the most? And don't forget to subscribe to Tales of Twist for more stories that challenge, inspire, and remind us of the complexities of the human experience. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.